Hello. In the Crown of Aragon, 639 years ago, it was February 20th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Multcara Companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. Let's begin today's document. We find today's document in the same register as yesterday. It's one attributed to Joan. It's actually on the same folio that we were looking at yesterday. The letter, or I should say document, right below the one for the safe conduct of Jacob de Bar, the Troubadour. Below that document, the next one has a really gorgeous heading. I don't know what inspired the scribe to just go all out with this header. It is in thick ink and it's just got larger letters than usual. And I think it's just a example of how really gorgeous this handwriting can be. And it's in Latin, the heading, but the document itself is in Catalan. The heading is Pro quibusdam mercatoribus Perpignani. That is something that I can easily understand. It's for some merchants of Perpignan. So this document is issued by Joan. It's for a group of merchants, so this is definitely plural. The endings of each of the words in that phrase indicate that it's plural. But then, really, there's only one person mentioned. Maybe the captain of the ship? I'm not sure, because sometimes the person who was getting documentation for a navigational adventure, a merchant shipment, was not necessarily the captain, but could be the financer of the journey, the trade journey. So the person that's named in this letter is Guillaume Ramon of Perpignan. And then the letter itself mentions that there's other merchants involved, but they're just referred to as homens mercaderens, or something, can't quite figure out the ending of the mercader part of that phrase, but the merchant men, the merchants organizers, or the people who themselves are the sailors possibly are included here. I would actually lean towards thinking that the intention here is for the leadership, the people who were in that captain role, or otherwise those responsible for the overall success of this voyage. The date, of course, is February 20th, and I mention that again because it was just a couple days ago that we looked at a letter from Violante to her father, and then another similar one to her brother. in which Violante uses the word malaltia de febre, well, the phrase, a illness of fever, and then very anxiously, I think, tells her father and brother to not believe any information that they receive through the rumor mill that Joanne is in ill health. She says that he's recovered, that all the doctors say that he has left peril, that he's no longer in this death's door kind of state. I mention all this because the letter that we're looking at today, and again, oh gosh, I use the word. I'm so used to using the word letter, but it's not really a letter. It's more of a document, because Joanne is not like writing to Guillaume Ramon as like a correspondent. He's issuing him a government document. So this government document is basically just saying that they're going to have some kind of business associated with France, or some kind of interaction with French goods, or interactions with French members of their crew, and that they need to make sure to protect all of the French things that they have, just as vigorously as they would protect the stuff that's their own. I'm not quite sure why this is necessary to specify. My feeling is that if you're a captain on a merchant vessel, that if you get into trouble, you're going to try to save all the goods. But maybe if you were encountered by pirates or something, you might have in mind a kind of hierarchy for what you would hand over to them as ransom, or as kind of a toll to kind of fulfill the extortionary situation there. And you might say, well, the stuff from France, it's of less importance. So, all right, that's the content of the letter. But remember, I brought up the situation of Joanne's illness and his recovery that Violante had just mentioned 2 days before. Why am I doing that? It's because there is this line at the end of the letter that I was just really surprised to read. I'll read it out in the Catalan, and then I'll translate it as best I can into English. Here's the Catalan. It's the last line of the letter before the dating clause. E hayats. Oh gosh, I already am running into trouble here. Oh yeah, okay, sorry. Okay, let me start again. I hayats a que scri letra así com si era signata de nostra ma com per accident de nostra persona aquella, and then let's see, aquella no hayam signada. Did you hear the word accident in there? Yeah. So I was completely surprised to see this line mentioning misfortune in the first person plural. What this line translates to, roughly, is that, okay, I'll just kind of say it. You have this written letter as if I had signed it with my own hand, because of a misfortune to my person. I did not sign it, or it does not have my signature. This sentence just has so much meaning to unpack, it has put the lens of disability studies firmly into our process here, because Joanne is not able to sign the document himself. I have on my agenda for reading up on the context of this whole situation of Joanne's illness and sickliness, I have on my agenda to get way more familiar with disability studies and the effect of disability studies on historical methodology, the way that academic historians approach working with evidence from the past that has been impacted by the insights of disability studies. And I haven't gotten as far into understanding disability studies as I would like. And so that was one of my main missions for this year. As I'm looking at these documents, I wanted to, as I went through this year, get more familiar with disability studies. I currently have a surface level understanding of the critique of disability studies. The scholarship on disability studies really got going over the last 40 years. There's certainly been critiques of the way that there are assumptions of able-bodiedness in our society and in the histories that we write that were published and well known way earlier than the last 40 years. But in terms of an academic discipline, disability studies really became established as one of the core methodologies in historical in the work of history in the historical discipline, really starting in the 1980s and the 1990s. And the major approach of disability studies is that disability is socially constructed. Now that means that what counts as a disability, what counts as somebody having some kind of disability, is not determined in the way that we might stereotypically think of it, as having something that's happened to your body that makes it so you can't do things. That is a very simplistic way of thinking about disability, and it puts the entire character of disability on an individual whose body is affected by something. The insight of disability studies is to really challenge that and to observe that what's going on among the group of human beings in a society is producing this status of disability. And my favorite analogy that I have heard about this is about eyesight. So before corrective lenses, somebody whose eyesight was not at 20/20 vision, or maybe far away from 20/20 vision, they would have absolutely been disabled. They wouldn't have been able to function in society with the same ease as somebody who had near 20/20 vision. And so they would have counted as disabled, absolutely, because their functioning in the surrounding society would have been limited. With corrective lenses, though, eyesight became actually very, very different, so that you can wear glasses and then later contact lenses and function in society as if you were someone with 20/20 vision. Now, of course, that doesn't include every single person whose eyesight is not 20/20, but it really changed the way that people thought about able-bodiedness when it came to eyesight. And today, somebody who wears glasses is not considered disabled, whereas in the time that we're talking about with the documents in this podcast this season, absolutely somebody who would require a strong prescription for corrective lenses in our time, they would have been severely limited in their activities, and they would have been in a category of not able-bodied. So what's happening in the surrounding society and the technology that it uses and the activities that it deems fundamental to moving around in that society, that's what sets the parameters. That's what sets the boundaries of disability versus able-bodiedness. So when historians take that insight and apply it to their study of the past, certain things become more noteworthy. So in this document, we're going to read against the grain because the document itself is not about ability or disability. The document is about granting some authorizations to this group of merchants and telling them to be careful about the stuff from France. That's what this document is about. We're going to actually read against the grain of this document and focus in on this last sentence about Joanne not being able to sign the document himself. Look at how, when you have a person placed in a position of such importance in the society, the apparatus that gets invoked to overcome or overlook their disability and the way that it is legitimated. So it's operating at a couple of different levels. First of all, he has scribes. Other people regularly are writing for him. That is not typical of the literate classes, even among the elite. Most of the elite who could read and write, they would be writing themselves in their own hand. It was only the super elite who regularly had scribes writing for them. So in this situation, we have Joanne's disability, in a sense, covered up. Because look at all the documents that we have been reviewing, that we were attributing to Joanne. Well, for how long has he not been able to write himself physically? Has it been since he started out his journey to Barcelona from Girona on January 3rd? Has he not been able to write? Has his writing hand or arm been immobile this whole time? And look at how the apparatus of the state has moved to obscure that and instead present Joanne as fully abled, and how all of our assumptions would have led us to continue thinking of Joanne as able-bodied when it came to his duty to sign documents, until we see this line. No one has written about Joanne using the lens in their writing, their historical writing about him, using the lens of disability studies. And I'm really excited to bring that into the historiography. So, why did Joanne feel that he had to have this line added now to this letter? Is it because the monarch's actual signature was so customary for documents like these, which would be presumably taken overseas and shown to people far and wide? Was it an expectation to be able to see a recognizable and legitimate looking signature from the king? Was that something that was so customary that its absence required explanation, as we see here? I guess. I mean, it seems to me rather strange that all the other documents that we've seen didn't require this. But, this is the first document that really seems to be intended to be carried a vast distance, like more vast than to France, like the document above. And it's also involved in this very international context of the trade, shipping routes, and all of the kinds of contexts and situations that one would encounter as they're going on a boat along the Mediterranean. And I say along the Mediterranean because to use the word across is a misnomer. The ships were not going as the crow flies from one port to another in the Mediterranean. If you wanted to go to the Levant, you would mostly be hugging the coastline because it was safer than going out into the middle of the open sea. So, but that then brings you into contact with just all these other vessels and all these encounters. So all of these encounters, maybe that's what would require the monarch's signature versus the journey of Jacob de Bar, the troubadour, going overland to wherever he's going in France. I just don't know, but that's my guess. And the addition of this line has really made it much more urgent for me to get up to speed with disability studies. So I'm just going to mention two works of edited essays that I think are going to be very foundational for understanding the role of disability studies in historical methodology right now. The first is a collection by Rekunbier, Kudlik, and Nielsen. It's the Oxford Handbook of Disability History. And then the other one that I'm going to be looking at is Barclay and Hunt Kennedy as editors. The title is Cripping the Archive, Disability, History, and Power. So I'm going to be looking at those collections starting this week, and I'm going to be really trying to incorporate those insights much more thoroughly than I have done so far. I've alluded to some of this when I've talked about Joanne's illness, but it's time to make this really central. I just am really, wow. Okay, one last thing, we're really over time here, but one last thing to mention is that there's some reason that a lot of this letter has been duplicated in what's further down on this same folio, and I honestly can't quite figure out why it was necessary to write this a second time. And let me just see. Yeah, it doesn't have a separate addressee listed at the bottom of the letter, which is actually on the next folio, 32R. So I am perplexed by the addition of another round of this same letter that, by the way, also includes the same line at the end about Joanne not being able to sign the letter because of an accident to his person, misfortune to his person. Whew. Okay, so really just an awesome discovery, one of the most important discoveries in the the podcast so far, I think, is discussed today, and I am really gonna have my attention focused on whether we have other references to Joanne's body coming up in other documents. But I'm still just feeling really I'm just still really surprised that this was added into this letter. This document. Well, he refers it to the letter. That's one of the reasons I keep doing that. He says a questa letra. Okay. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt cara compagnona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I have done my job, because remember, the motto of The Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Visit the website to see an image of today's document, additional show notes, and a bunch of bibliographic citations for foundational and recent works in disability history. And listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. In the meantime, take care.